Let's start with a simple question. What do you really know about polio? I'm betting it goes something like this. A terrifying disease emerges sometime in the not-too-distant past. Some lives are taken, others are left crippled or paralyzed for life. Scientists race to isolate the virus, create a vaccine, and finally bring the nightmare to an end. That's the version most of us grew up with. But what if that story is wildly, shockingly incomplete? What if the story of polio runs far deeper than we've ever imagined, and the most astonishing, most revealing pieces of the puzzle have been hiding in plain sight? In this episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel, we go in depth into The Moth and the Iron Lung by Forrest Maready and the untold story of polio, one of metals, moths, and microbes, and a century-old epidemic with shocking parallels to COVID-19. If you think this is just a story of virus and vaccination, brace yourself. The real story was far more than I ever could have imagined. Welcome to another episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel. It is so good to be back. I'm back. We're back. It's all good. The show goes on. I took a week off last week because of a family trip. We spent some time in Portugal. We saw Lisbon, a town called Thoery, and Golega. I think I'm pronouncing those correctly. And it was just amazing. Just an awesome trip. Beautiful country, friendly people, and of course, beautiful horses. And we didn't plan it this way, but our trip happened to overlap with the National Horse Festival, which occurs every year in a little town called Golega, which is about an hour and 30 minutes outside of Lisbon. And essentially, for almost a week, this little town shuts down, and it's just all horses. Show jumping, dressage competitions, but also maybe the coolest thing, which are traditional Portuguese equitation arts, including working equitation and carriage driving. It's literally just like a giant street festival with food trucks and vendors all alongside of horses, right? It's like Mardi Gras, but better with horses. Just awesome. Hard to put a number on it, but if I had to guess, I'd say maybe 30 to 40% of the people you can tell are really there for the horses, but the other people, they're just there for the party. And it was a really good time. Just an amazing place. And Lisbon, great. Old city, fantastic, walkable city, really enjoyed it. And Thoery, a city I'd never even heard of. And we wound up staying there just because of all the hotels being booked in Golega. But definitely, things happen for a reason. It's a town with such a rich history, a castle that was once the stronghold of the Knights Templar and later converted into a convent, which is just in spectacular, absolutely pristine condition. If you have a chance to see any of it, all of it, I'd highly recommend it. But we're back from travel adventures to continue the adventure that is this baby podcast. Episode number 13, I believe. Well, so actually, on second thought, maybe we're more like a toddler podcast, like a big, drooling, smiley toddler, right? That's us, right? Episode 13, but it's good. I'm glad to be here. Now, if you've been with me for a while, welcome. I'm glad to have you back again. If you're new to the show, welcome to you too. I'm glad to have you, truly. We're going to have some fun today. We've got a massive episode, one I've really been looking forward to. And if you were thinking to yourself, oh man, we missed a week, don't worry. Today makes up for it. Okay, today makes up for it. We're going to talk polio. Oh, but before I do, I have a massive, sincere, heartfelt thank you for the ratings and reviews that have come in for our young show. A recent Apple Podcast review really put a smile on my face. So thank you so much. I am very grateful. And as I've said before, these topics mean a lot to me. I do believe that we are living in just an incredible time, and that these are among the most important topics that we could be discussing as a species. Every review, every share, every follow, it will help me grow this show into what I know it can become and help me push these topics as far and as wide as we possibly can. So thank you so much. So polio. There's a hell of a transition from Portugal to polio. But we're going to blast forward. Like I said, this is a massive episode. And I'll say this from the start. There are many ways to tackle this story. And like so many topics that we discuss in this podcast, there are many levels on which we could discuss the story. And it's going to be very tempting for those who have heard about some of the recent controversy around polio, say from the work of Dr. Suzanne Humphries, who appeared on Joe Rogan's show a few months ago, or some of the backlash from that conversation, frankly. It's tempting for many to want to frame this discussion on polio around the polio virus and the vaccine, or I should say, vaccines that have been developed to be used in the fight against polio. Are vaccines responsible for the decline in polio, therefore representing one of the earliest and most important wins of the vaccine program? Not to mention, an incredible medical and scientific breakthrough, a true paradigm shift in humanity's fight against the scourge of epidemic disease. Or did the decline in paralytic polio happen much earlier, prior to the mass adoption of vaccines, with vaccines in the best case being given undue credit for a trend line that would have continued in the absence of the vaccines, and perhaps in a worse case, actually the only thing keeping the polio disease alive at this point through the incidence of vaccine-strained polio? I get the temptation. I get the temptation to view the question of vaccines and polio as the most interesting and maybe the most important aspect of the story. I really do. In light of COVID-19 and the rollout of the mRNA platform, I get it. There are a lot of questions about vaccines. And as we'll get into in the story, there are a lot of parallels, some very surprising and shocking parallels between COVID-19 and polio. And we're going to talk about many of them today. But as tempting as it might be, I'm going to encourage you not to jump to the question of vaccines and polio. There is much, much more to this story. I promise you that. Whether you think vaccines are amazing, atrocious, or somewhere in between, doesn't matter. You are going to want to hear the rest of this story. Okay, trust me, it's really not what you think. And for this conversation, we are going to rely heavily on a book by Forrest Maready called The Moth and the Iron Lung. Now, if you haven't read this book, you are going to want to remedy that. You're going to want to remedy that right now. Ebook, audiobook, physical book, doesn't matter. Do yourself a favor and get yourself a copy. This book is incredible. I am a huge fan of The Moth and the Iron Lung, and I'm going to tell you why. First, I love when outsiders go deep on a subject. Maready is not a doctor, a scientist, or a medical professional. He's not even a historian. I believe he studied something like music, but he has captured, described, maybe even discovered something incredible about polio, and as we'll discuss later, maybe about the nature of human health overall. Now, Forrest Maready is not yet a household name, but I am not alone in thinking that this guy may really, really be onto something here. After reading Forrest Maready's book for the first time about a year ago, I listened to an interview that he gave with Brett Weinstein of the Dark Horse podcast. And for those who are unfamiliar with Brett Weinstein, he's an evolutionary biologist, a podcaster, and I guess you could say he's a bit of a polymath. Just a guy who's very interesting and is interested in a lot of subjects. And like me, he's a guy who's interested in the details. He likes the nuance. He likes the stakes. He likes the context. He doesn't fit easily into a box. And he's an academic, or at least he was an academic. So he's a bit closer to that world, the world of publishing, science, and credentials. And I think it's fair to say that, like me, Weinstein is impressed, blown away, that this guy, Forrest Maready, outside of academia, a non-doctor, a non-scientist, just a normal person, found this thread in the story of polio. He followed it and connected the dots in a way that possibly no one else ever has. And it's just incredible. And I'll say this, I'm a sucker for these sorts of stories. I love stories of the outsider, the untrained, the self-taught, just the passionate obsessive, who despite the odds is the one to see the pattern, to make the breakthrough, to just believe and achieve. Now, this has absolutely nothing to do with polio, and this is going back a few years. But a while back, I watched a documentary called Apex, The Making of the Hypercar. Came out in 2016. Well done from what I recall. Very enjoyable, even if you're not into cars. But this documentary goes into the story behind some of the world's most expensive and exclusive hypercars. Okay, so we're not talking sports cars, not supercars. We're talking hypercars. If you're not a car guy or girl, these are the most expensive, exclusive performance vehicles money can buy. If you're thinking BMW, Audi, or even Mercedes, not in the same league, not even close. These are brands that you may never have heard of, and it's likely you've never even seen in person. Brands like Hennessy, Koenigsegg, Pagani. Think what Bruce Wayne might drive when he's not in the Batmobile, okay? Absolutely beautiful machines with a performance and price tag to match. Close to $2 million at the low end. Just a different category of vehicle. But what I found absolutely fascinating is that in the case of at least two of these car makers, both Koenigsegg and Pagani, the founders of the company, the brains behind these incredible companies making these once-in-a-lifetime machines, they were self-taught. Yes, you heard that right. Self-taught hypercar builders. And I'm not talking like 150 years ago. I mean now, within our lifetime, as in just a few years ago. These were guys on internet forums and other places trying to learn things on their own. And a few decades later, they're creating the most exclusive performance vehicles on the planet. I mean, it's nuts. It's absolute madness. It doesn't happen, except when it does. And in this case, lightning struck twice. Let's take Christian von Koenigsegg, the founder of Koenigsegg. No experience in the automotive industry, just a guy in Sweden with access to the internet trying to build a supercar. Sounds insane, but he did. As in, he just studied everything that he could, asked questions online, and he just built one. Taught himself how to work with materials like carbon fiber, literally creating the molds from hand using wood forms. Orazio Pagani of Pagani Motors. If memory serves, he's of Italian heritage, but I think he grew up in Argentina. Just obsessed from the time he was young with cars and the iconic Italian brands like Ferrari and Lamborghini. At age 17, he moves to Italy to get a job literally as a janitor at Lamborghini. And he works his way up from the lowest position in the company, sweeping floors, to the chief engineer of the brand, until ultimately breaking out on his own and starting the iconic company that has his namesake. And his name, it's Horatio. Like Horatio Alger, right? I mean, how crazy is this? How can it get any better? And if you haven't seen Pagani Motors vehicles, just do yourself a favor. Fire up your browser of choice. Check out the Zonda, the Wyra, or the Utopia. Just incredible machines. And the guy is a true artist. No Photoshop, no CAD drawings from what I understand. He hand sketches many of the components, and you can tell. And they're works of art. Like I said, it's just incredible. But as in the case of these two men, Koenigsegg and Pagani, what Forrest Maready has done as a self-taught outsider, it's just incredible. Now, it's easy for me to say that, but in order for me to back that statement, in order to understand the significance of what Maready has outlined in The Moth and the Iron Lung, it helps to first consider the conventional story regarding polio, what most of us understand about polio. And in short, it's something like this. Sometime in the past, not exactly sure when, but definitely when photos were black and white, we had this dreadful disease called polio. And in some cases, maybe even in many cases, polio caused paralysis or death. But in some cases, people recovered with or without the assistance of this scary, sort of ominous-looking contraption with an equally ominous-sounding name, an iron lung. Oh, and it was caused by a virus. And I think FDR was paralyzed by polio maybe, and the press covered it up, something that likely would not have happened today. Oh, and we don't have to worry about polio because vaccines have eradicated polio. How'd we do? Be honest. That sounds about right, doesn't it? Now, maybe you've already been exposed to the work of Dr. Suzanne Humphries, either directly through her book Dissolving Illusions or from her appearance on the Joe Rogan show. And so you get that story is, well, let's just say it's an oversimplification at best. But barring that, that's pretty much the understanding that most of us have about polio. Paralytic polio happened in the past. It was caused by a virus. The vaccine defeated polio. No more polio. Easy peasy. Open shut case. But if Forrest Maready is correct, then nearly every aspect of that statement, the origins of polio, the cause of paralysis, polio being a thing of the past, along with the eradication of polio at the hands of the vaccine, requires a massive, massive asterisk. Now, I've made the assertion that the implications of vaccines and polio are quite possibly the least interesting aspect of the story. And one of the reasons I'm such a fan of this book is that it is incredibly nuanced and broad-reaching. As I've said, Maready makes connections, dare I say contributions, to our understanding of polio, which really opened my eyes to the historical context and I will argue have major, major implications for human health today. And very few people are talking about them. Not only that, there are some incredibly eerie parallels between a polio epidemic from 100 years ago and the COVID-19 pandemic. So, if the story of polio isn't fundamentally one of vaccine versus virus, then what is it? Well, in short, it is a story of metals, microbes, and quite possibly malevolence. And we're going to get into each one of the aspects of the story, so buckle up and prepare to have your mind blown. What do metals, moths, and metallic medicine have to do with polio? So let's talk metals. What do metals have to do with polio, a virus? Well, it turns out a lot. And I'm going to drop my usual caveat here, followed by my usual plug. We'll get into some good detail here, but we can't cover everything. And truth be told, I don't want to cover everything. Part of my bias, part of my motivation for this podcast is to spread these ideas and encourage more people to engage directly with these ideas, to buy and to read books like The Moth and the Iron Lung. So there will be some spoilers, but I promise you, even if you listen to this entire episode multiple times, still buy the book. Still worth the read. And I'm jumping off my soapbox now, and I stick the landing. The crowd cheers wildly, and we march on with medals and the start of the polio story. Now, I'll point out that this is not the typical start of the polio story as most versions would have it. Most go back to maybe the 1916 outbreak in New York City as a starting place for the story of polio. Maybe some of the super nerds might point to some small, disconnected outbreaks in small farming towns in New England. Maybe some, but not Maready. For him, the story goes back even farther, all the way back to the Civil War. I told you, I like this book. So, during the Civil War, the southern states cut off the export of cotton to the North, eliminating a critical material for the manufacture of clothing and other critical goods. As the North looked for alternatives to Southern cotton, other materials, including silk, were considered as possible substitutes. But here's the thing. Silkworms are finicky. They are fragile. They're not very prolific. They're adapted to certain food types. And according to Maready, they're essentially dependent on their human handlers to survive due to thousands of years of domestic breeding. But this guy named Etienne Trouvelot, a scientist, an entomologist from France, he comes to America right around the time of the Civil War, specifically to work on this problem, to improve the resilience and adaptability of the silkworm for the United States. And where the silkworm may be fragile and non-prolific, the gypsy moth is anything but. It's hardy, it's prolific, and with an appetite for oak leaves, something the northeastern United States has plenty of. But the gypsy moth doesn't produce useful silk. So Trouvelot's idea is to crossbreed the gypsy moth with the silkworm. So he smuggles some back from Europe to the United States. And before his project can bear fruit, two things happen. the Civil War is over, and some of Trouvelot's gypsy moth eggs are accidentally released into the wild. Trouvelot apparently knows this is a big deal when it happens. With few, if any, natural predators, the gypsy moth has already created substantial devastation in parts of Europe, multiplying into the billions, consuming crops, forests, and foliage. Trouvelot tries to recover as many of the moth eggs as he possibly can and to warn authorities in the United States. But this is the late 1800s. The concept of an invasive species is still in its infancy, so his warnings fall on deaf ears, and for a few years after their accidental release, nothing happens. Or so it would seem. The moths have been busy, quietly laying millions of eggs in Medford, a small town in Massachusetts outside of Boston, where Trouvelot had set up his operation. Now, it goes unnoticed by the town's residents until one morning, the residents wake up to the horror of millions and millions of caterpillars hatched en masse, deliberately and methodically eating everything. Now, from the descriptions that Maready gives, it's like a scene from an Old Testament plague. Gypsy moth caterpillars eat the leaves of all the trees. They wipe out the crops, and they begin to devour the trees themselves. Still far from sated, they get to work on the houses themselves. And all of this happens within a couple of days. It's biblical. By the time the town realizes what's happening, there's nothing that can be done. Any efforts to remove the caterpillars manually, burn them with kerosene, create sticky barriers on the trees, it's all in vain. It's like a drop in the ocean. The destructive power of the gypsy moth marches on. News of the devastation in Medford hits the national news, and concern over the spread beyond the town becomes an immediate priority. A government task force is established to try to find a solution. Anything that will halt the spread of the dreadful gypsy moth. Finally, an answer. A chemist working with the National Task Force has discovered a compound, a pesticide that has been shown to kill the gypsy moth effectively and hopefully stop the spread. It's a combination of lead and arsenic known as lead arsenate. Now, this is before the mass adoption of pesticides. Most food is grown the old-fashioned way, organically, with bugs as an unfortunate but acknowledged byproduct. Concepts like long-term safety, minimum concentrations for effectiveness, and species adaptations, these are all considerations that are years or decades away. For now, the mission is urgent and it is clear. Stop the spread of the gypsy moth by any means necessary. And now, armed with lead arsenate, a powerful weapon in the fight against the gypsy moth, the mandate is clear. Spray, baby, spray. Teams of men with horses and very early mechanized sprayers launching a full frontal assault against the invasive moths. And they coat everything in lead arsenate, the miracle chemical that is turning the tide in the battle against the gypsy moth. And for the first time, containment seems possible. But at what price? For as victory over the gypsy moth seems inevitable, as the entire country celebrates the war that was waged and won in Massachusetts, reports of a new scourge, a noticeable increase in the incidence of poliomyelitis, are on the horizon. I'll say it now, but I told you. I told you that this story is way, way more than vaccines. So let's plow ahead. Now you know where this is going. We're going to talk polio in the aftermath of literal chemical warfare waged in Medford, Massachusetts, and in surrounding towns. But even if we anticipate that a chemical which combines both lead and arsenic is likely not going to be health-promoting for humans, what does that have to do with polio, which we understand to be a virus? So first, what do we mean when we say polio? Now, this is a basic question, but it turns out that this is an absolutely essential question in the story of polio. Definitions always matter, but in this case, the time period in which we're talking about polio, the context in which we're talking about polio, Well, it really, really matters. What we refer to as polio is short for poliomyelitis. Polio coming from the Greek word for gray, and myelitis meaning inflammation of the spinal cord. When a person or animal was suffering from paralysis, upon autopsy, doctors would often confirm gray lesions on the spinal cord. So they started to refer to the condition as polio, gray, myelitis, inflammation of the spinal tissue. And we should note right away that the term poliomyelitis goes back, way back before the discovery of viruses. So how could that be? Because the term poliomyelitis, for much of medical history, did not refer to a root cause, didn't refer to a virus, it referred to a collection of symptoms, notably paralysis. If an infant, adult, or an animal suffered from a sudden paralysis in the absence of some accident or physical trauma to the spine, doctors would have described that person as having suffering from a poliomyelitis, gray lesions on the spine. This is an incredibly significant point, and Maready does a great job of hitting this critical point home. When doctors first started using the term poliomyelitis, or polio, they were describing a collection of symptoms. They were not pointing to a specific virus. The term was used much differently than we use today, and if we miss that small detail in the story of polio, that the term polio has been used to describe both sudden paralysis of an unknown origin and a specific virus, it's likely that we will miss the story of polio completely. Now, I've made this point before, but I'm constantly amazed by the number of instances in health and nutrition where the same word is used to describe two different things. And it's as if to set up a near-permanent misunderstanding on the subject. We use the term burn to describe both a physical fire and the process of mitochondria converting food energy to cellular energy. We use the term cholesterol to refer to both dietary cholesterol and blood cholesterol, making it all but impossible for people to get that consuming additional cholesterol will have no effect on blood cholesterol. Eating more saturated fats will raise your cholesterol. Eating more cholesterol will not. Confusing. We talked about this in the episode on seed oils in more detail, but you get the point, right? Dietary fat, body fat. We use the same word. Will eating more fat make you fat? I don't know. Talk to the keto people. It's confusing. And as I've mentioned, this is incredibly important to the story of polio. Why? Because it turns out that a viral infection is not the only possible cause of inflammation of the spinal cord. It turns out that this inflammation leading to paralysis on the spine can be caused by exposure to metals. If we understand polio to mean paralytic polio, or the onset of paralysis in the absence of physical trauma, as has been the case for much of history, confusingly, the polio virus is not the only thing that can cause polio. And the acceptance of this one fact, which I believe Maready makes the case for clearly and eloquently, is what sets us up to see that this story that most of us understand about polio, the mystery virus, the paralysis, the eradication of polio through vaccines, is incomplete at best. So let's get back to metals. Let's tie this story back together and pick back up with our story of the gypsy moth and the fresh victory that humanity has wrestled from the ravages of the gypsy moth through the use of the miracle chemical, lead arsenate, a chemical combination which combines two substances with known neurotoxicity to humans, lead and arsenic. And let's recall the mechanized spraying, the coating of anything and everything to stop the spread of the voracious moth, caution to the wind, quite literally the fog of war. And in the aftermath of that victory, when several children and animals come down with a mystery paralysis, what doctors then would have referred to as a poliomyelitis, we get what are possibly the first outbreaks of poliomyelitis in the United States. Now, of course, this connection, this line that Maready draws from lead arsenate to paralytic polio is not commonly understood now, but it would have been even less so at the time of the outbreak. Even if we accept the connection between paralytic polio and metals exposure as presented by Maready, and there will be people who would challenge that notion directly, we are operating with the benefit of about 120 years of hindsight. Even if the connection between metals and paralysis is something new to you, as it was to me, most of us know about the dangers of lead, right? We know that kids shouldn't eat paint chips, chew on pencils because of potential lead exposure, connections with brain damage, etc. We know that our gasoline is unleaded. We know that if you go into a bathroom and say a gun range, they have special soap because of lead. And arsenic? Even worse. Arsenic has no business near a human body. I think when most of us hear arsenic, we just think poison, right? I mean, no further explanation needed. It's why we don't eat the seeds of the apple. It's one of the arguments against eating rice, even though it's found in minuscule amounts in both cases. So when you try to wrap your head around using lead arsenate, even in a dire situation like the fight against the gypsy moth, it's tempting to think, man, what were those people thinking? I mean, how could they not know how toxic these substances were? And especially when you consider that the success of the solution against the gypsy moth is going to lead directly into its use as a pesticide on food crops, yeah, it sort of boggles the mind. But this is also a calculus that we can completely understand, especially if we translate this into our modern setting. The use of toxic chemicals in the service of humanity is nothing new. Just because something is a poison does not mean we won't employ it in service to humanity. Pesticides, medicines, cleaning supplies, cosmetics, many of our most commonly used products come with a toxic effect. In many cases, that's precisely why we use them. And as the saying goes, the dose makes the poison. But let's be clear, even though this was over 100 years ago, they knew that these substances were toxic. But just like in the case of our modern pesticides, the goal is to keep the concentration high enough to do the job, in this case, kill the gypsy moth, but low enough as to not be toxic to humans. It's a fine line. And of course, finding this line is way easier said than done. Easier when we're talking about acute toxicity, sure, but you start stretching the timeline in terms of months and years, across decades or even a lifetime of exposure, well, it's impossible to know. Not to mention when you start adding other variables, like cumulative effects due to multiple exposure points and synergistic effects with other toxic compounds. In a word, impossible. And again, before we judge with 20/20 hindsight, let's keep in mind the stakes. The destruction of your crops, your property, and potentially your homes, your livelihood. Known, real, upfront losses pitted against some potential, down-the-road, theoretical effects. I mean, if this were happening today, we all know what the talking points would be. There are no studies linking lead arsenate with paralysis, and they wouldn't be wrong. Again, not so different. And I try to put myself in their shoes, and it's easy for me to say, no, man, I'd be the lone guy screaming from the hilltops, you fools, you'll kill us all. Maybe. But I will say this, the stakes are very real and certainly ones that we can relate to today. Because here's the thing, we can also see that the incredibly toxic world that we live in, full of chemicals in the water, pesticides, food dyes, additives, opioids, and other pharmaceuticals, well, this is essentially the story arc of every last one of them. It's a sobering reality. To exist in the modern world, to enjoy the unprecedented convenience, comfort, and entertainment that we've grown to define as life, it comes with a cost. And it's a cost that often is only able to be calculated with hindsight, well after the die has been cast, and change is too late. Now, the story of metals and polio is much deeper than the emergency deployment of lead arsenate. Ultimately, the spread of the gypsy moth was slowed and eventually stopped. some scientists did draw a connection between lead arsenate and the outbreak of polio at the time, but they were in a minority position. Lead arsenate would become an invaluable tool for farmers and food producers in the never-ending quest to increase crop yield. And Maready lays out the connection between the use of this pesticide and others with the emergence of polio in both isolated and in epidemic cases. Again, there is so much to cover here, so we got to pick and choose. But I'll say this, I am convinced by the case that Maready lays out. It's one that is nuanced and detailed, and you're going to want to read for yourself. Part of the reason why I'm convinced is because of Maready's explanation as to how these metals might cause paralysis in the first place. And again, he's not a scientist here, not a medical doctor, but this explanation is very convincing. And to set the stage for this explanation, it's helpful to consider that there are a few things that are odd about these early cases of paralytic polio. This is a story that really has to be considered sequentially. The time period really, really matters to understanding the emergence of polio. So we're going to talk about a few oddities in the early story of polio, not exhaustive, and again, hint, hint, by the book, but here are just a few. First, early cases of paralytic polio were far more likely to involve children than adults, often children at a specific milestone, at or around the eruption of their first molars, infants of teething age. Second, unlike most diseases, which seem to claim the least vital in, say, a given family, early paralytic polio was the opposite, more often an affliction of the most active, the most vital, very often active young boys. Lastly, in the early outbreaks, oftentimes it was both humans and animals who were affected. Now, this may seem like a minor detail, but I assure you it is not. And again, Maready, he just nails it, okay? Now, each of these oddities is significant. Each means something as we unpack the untold story of polio. So let's dig into each one in a bit more detail. Now, from our modern understanding, when you hear polio in infants, your brain likely goes to something like acquired immunity, right? Acquired immunity to a virus. Infants are more susceptible to polio because they don't have immunity to the polio virus. And there may be some truth to that. But again, there's something odd about this particular paralysis, about this instance of polio. Occurrence is still rare, but if it does occur, it so predictably happens at or around the time of teething that it is referred to the people at the time as teething paralysis. In other words, if this were the result of a lack of acquired immunity, we would expect to see the incidence of disease distributed relatively evenly across childhood prior to the acquisition of the disease. But we don't. It's all clustered up right around the time of teething. And people notice. So much so that they call it teething paralysis. Now, for the super nerds in the group, and no judgment, I'm there too, you're thinking, aha, maternal antibodies. That's probably close to when children were weaning. Major props for those instincts, definite, well-deserved pat on the back. But Maready addresses this as well. And nope, not it either. And because we're already super, super deep and we need to come up for air or this is going to turn into a 10-hour podcast, I'm going to punt on this one. I'm going to refer you back to the book, but I will say this. He does address it. And your instincts are right, but I'm convinced by the case Maready makes here as well. Now, maybe you've paused and you furiously flipped back to the book. Perhaps some are still with me. And for those who are, let's talk about the connection between teething and paralysis. The missing link, if you will. And in short, it has to do with teething powders, the most common, widely accepted practice, doctor-advised solution to infantile teething pain, a product called Steedman's teething powder, made from a chemical called calomel, otherwise known as mercury chloride. Mercury. Yes, that mercury, one of the most neurotoxic substances known to man. As in, the reason you're not supposed to eat too much fish. As in, the reason that thimerosal, a mercury-based preservative, was removed from vaccines over safety concerns. The reason why haberdashers who worked with mercury were known for going insane, yes, Mad Hatter, Alice in Wonderland, was based, from what I understand, on a sadly common occurrence of those handling the soft metal day in and day out. The most commonly, widely accepted teething powder given to infants at the time was made from mercury. Let that sink in for a second. And I know, the dose makes the poison, right? After all, even something like homeopathy involves toxins at incredible dilutions. But according to Maready, it's not a little bit of mercury. It's a whole lot. Maready tells us that children were being given doses that contained enough mercury to likely, quote, poison a full-grown man, end quote. Now, whether he means this literally or he's being a little bit funny here, you get the point. This wasn't a can of tuna fish. This was enough to purge the bowels immediately and to possibly do a lot worse. And again, while this sounds totally insane from our vantage point today, we have to consider this in its historical perspective. This is what some refer to as the age of metallic medicine. This is an idea that has gone the way of the dodo bird in our modern medical era. But purging the bowels as a solution to what ails you is nothing new. And this was cutting-edge medicine back in the day. And mercury is a very effective way to do the job. Now, by what mechanism would purging the bowels of a fussy infant resolve teething pain? I have no idea. Okay, but this was a commonly accepted practice. And again, we should be careful about throwing stones from our glass house of today. Let's consider a metal which is much more ubiquitous in our time. Aluminum, a substance which may be more neurotoxic than mercury. And it's everywhere. I mean, we use it to store our food, not to mention in food processing, in our cookware, and like mercury, in vaccines. When you think about it, it is a bit odd. And I'm not even saying anything about whether aluminum in these forms is a terrible idea or not. It's just that most of us have never even given it a second thought. It's just the world we live in. It is our world to use one of the most toxic metals we could find and use it to store our food, to drink out of it, and to add it to our medicines. Are we really so different? But back to teething powders. So if metals like lead and mercury are capable of causing paralysis, then we have a pretty obvious source of metals right here in the very medicines that we gave to our children. Okay, oddity number 2. How are we doing? Still with me? Let's discuss why polio, unlike the typical disease, seemed to affect the strongest, healthiest, and often most active members of a family, rather than the weakest. This was a point commented on by doctors of the day, and of course, was a mystery. And if we're only considering polio through the lens of our modern definition, that polio equals the polio virus, it's even more confusing. But if we consider what those active, healthy, young children, often boys, would have been doing, this puzzle piece may also fall into place. Possibly helping out on the farm, possibly running through fields, picking and eating fruit grown in the summer, and now being sprayed with a chemical that families were told was safe. Rather than washing the fruit, maybe doing what young, active children in summer months have done for centuries, picking and eating fresh fruit directly from the plant. Maybe. And unlike the fruit of their parents and grandparents, this fruit has been coated in lead arsenate or some other toxic metal, of which one of its redeeming qualities is that it doesn't wash off. Sounds a bit like our modern glyphosate, doesn't it? Again, another topic for a future episode, but when the pesticide glyphosate first hit the market, we were told that it was safe enough to drink. Okay, there's this crazy video of a debate between a guy at Monsanto and I'm not even sure, some health advocate or environmentalist. And the guy makes the claim on stage, oh, glyphosate is healthy enough to drink. And they'd been making this claim for a little while. And this is just brilliant. And the opponent, the environmentalist, the anti-glyphosate advocate, Says, I've heard that before, and here I actually have. And he pulls out a cup of glyphosate, and he says, if it's safe enough to drink, why don't you drink it? And the guy just gets so mad, and he's like hissing, and he's like, I'm not stupid. And it's like, yeah, but you think the rest of us are. I mean, it was just one of the most incredible moments from a debating standpoint that I've seen. Just spectacular. And how the guys at Monsanto didn't think that somebody was going to eventually call them on that, I don't know. That's also wild to me. But again, more obvious now, not obvious at the time. Billions of dollars paid in settlements to victims of non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, and I believe the proper word for that statement is insane. But let's stick with the story of polio, another mystery about polio, an oddity which, according to Maready, still puzzles scientists to this day. Whether we're talking about paralytic polio due to metal exposure or due to a viral infection, why was the disease more likely to affect children than adults? And why is paralysis more likely to affect, say, the legs as opposed to the arms or neck? Why the nerves responsible for movement, but not the nerves for feeling? And again, I believe this is an area where Maready, a non-scientist, non-doctor, non-medical guy, proposes an explanation that is both fascinating and, in my humble opinion, is likely right. So let's talk anatomy. Obviously 30,000-foot view here, but the spinal cord, that vital bundle of nerves, runs through the spinal column, right? We all know that. But what we may not know, or I didn't know, is that as we grow, from going from a baby to an adult, the location of the spinal cord relative to the intestines changes. The spinal cord moves further away as we grow through childhood, starting out from a position essentially touching the intestines to ending up a few inches away as an adult. Okay? So that's significant. In our day, we've heard a lot about the microbiome, leaky gut permeability. I believe I read somewhere that the lining of the gut is actually only a single cell thick. Single cell. So if we wind up with a toxic metal in the gut, either by consuming fruit sprayed with lead, arsenate, or from mercury-based teething powders, the metals have a special ability for cellular destruction. Is it possible that some breach may occur and that the location of the breach in the intestines may be significant? Whether the nerves of the spine are nestled, as Maready says, right up against the intestines, as they are with a young child, or located a few inches away, as the case with an adult. I don't know. Tell me. But he may be onto something here. Let's add one more interesting feature of spinal anatomy, that the nerves on the front side of the spine are responsible for something different than the nerves on the back side of the spine. The nerves on the front side closest to your belly button, ones closest to the intestines, hint, hint, are responsible for movement. The nerves on the back side, the ones closest to your back and butt, those are responsible for feeling, the sensation of touch. Well, isn't that interesting? And two things have been consistent with our observations of polio since the very beginning. One, the disease is likely to affect the nerves responsible for movement, but leave the nerves for feeling unharmed. And secondly, upon autopsy, the gray lesions of the spine, they are almost always found on the front half of the spine and not the back. Is it possible that these two features of spinal anatomy, the location of the spine relative to the intestines and the location of the nerves responsible for movement on the front half of the spine, are responsible for explaining some of the greatest mysteries surrounding polio that, according to Maready, still puzzle scientists to this day? Why children? Why movement but not feeling? Why the lower limbs? And is it possible that a non-scientist, a non-doctor, just some guy trained in music, but with an incredible mind for the subject matter, that he figured it out? I'll say this, I'm convinced. Okay, now didn't I tell you that this story is much, much more than virus and vaccine? Okay, absolutely fascinating. And here's the thing, this explanation, this contribution that I believe Maready has made to humanity's understanding of polio, well, we haven't talked viruses just yet, but I'll go ahead and say this, that it works the same, right? Okay, let's do one more. Let's talk animals and early polio. Well, there is something odd about the early outbreaks of polio. It's the fact that animals were affected. Okay, cows, horses, pigs, chickens. In these early episodes of polio, oftentimes reports of paralysis, again, destruction of the nerves responsible for movement, particularly of the lower limbs, affected animals in proximity to humans. And that is something that could only be described as odd with hindsight. And why would that be? Well, let's just recap where our story of polio is, compared to the story of polio we all understood from school. Paralytic polio is caused by the poliovirus. Poliovirus was eradicated through the mass adoption of vaccines. End of story. No gypsy moth, no lead arsenate, no mercury, none of that. But here's the thing. If that were true, if polio is everywhere and always caused by the poliovirus, and we'll get into it, there's something interesting about the poliovirus. Something that was discovered after these early polio outbreaks had already been described. Something that was discovered after the discovery of viruses and the isolation of the poliovirus as we know it. And that is that it pretty much never paralyzes an animal. That's right. Another mystery of polio, which occurs much later in our evolving story of polio. Paralyzes humans, doesn't paralyze animals. And when I say almost never, what I mean is specifically there is one species of animal that scientists have been able to cause paralysis in due to a poliovirus infection. And it's not a cow, it's not a horse, not a chicken or a dog. It's not even an animal that's found in the United States. It's an old world monkey called a rhesus monkey. This is why breaking the story of polio down into its proper timeline is so imperative. Because when we're talking about polio matters greatly. This is why the story is complex and nuanced and frankly beautiful. This is why the contributions of people in this space, including Forrest Maready, are so impressive. Why the story of polio is more like a multi-generational detective novel than a Jason Statham movie. Nothing wrong with Jason Statham movies either. These early cases of paralytic polio, what was referred to as poliomyelitis by the people documenting and attempting to understand the outbreaks, the fact that they included animals points to something other than a virus as the explanation. Quite possibly, and I'd be willing to say at this point, very likely points to metals. Now we're going to shift gears here, and we're going to start talking microbes. We're going to talk viruses and paralytic polio. And just like the story of metals, this story is nuanced. It's complex, and we're only going to scratch the surface here. So I'll go ahead and hop back on my soapbox and plug Maready's book, The Moth and the Iron Lung. There's much, much more to this book. And unlike many books on this subject, it's very enjoyable to read. Okay, Maready has a great writing style. If you're into audiobooks, he narrates the audio version as well. It's quite good. As I've mentioned before, one of the things that is so fascinating here is that the story of polio spans multiple decades, multiple stages of scientific and medical discovery. And so the time and context matters greatly. The development of the microscope, germ theory, discovery of viruses, and of course, the development of vaccines, all happens within this story arc of polio. And I've made the point of hammering home on this podcast that the context matters. The historical setting really matters. And it's often what's missed in these conversations about important subjects. And with these new tools, these new breakthroughs, the microscope, theory of germs as an explanation for disease, of viruses and of vaccines, well, of course, they're going to be applied in understanding the nature of this puzzling disease, as well as employed as weapons in the fight. So the quest to find the cause for polio, to isolate the microbe, be it a virus or a bacteria, well, it's on. And eventually, the poliovirus isolated, found, and named. Unlike what we probably tacitly assumed, the poliovirus was named as doctors assumed that it was responsible for causing the symptoms of polio, the gray lesions on the spine, sustained paralysis of poliomyelitis. Small point, but significant again. When we say polio today, we mean the virus. When they said polio back then, they meant the symptoms of polio. Now, why does this matter? Well, it matters because it turns out that what we understand as, quote, the polio virus is not the only virus capable of causing paralysis. Many viruses can cause a paralysis that looks identical to the polio virus. Coxsackie viruses, echoviruses, EVA71, EVD68, just to name a few. All can cause paralysis identical to that of the polio virus. All enteroviruses, viruses with a special affinity for replication within the GI tract. The GI tract, which includes the intestines, hint, hint, all can cause paralysis that would have historically just been described as polio. Okay, interesting. A little scary maybe, but why does this matter? Why does it matter if one virus or multiple viruses are capable of polio? Well, first and succinctly, in case you missed my obvious hint, hint, let's recall Maready's hypothesis on the proximity of the intestines to the spinal cord, the location of the motor nerves, and the ability for metals to disrupt the lining of the gut. Well, in a newly toxic world of both metal and microbe, is it possible that either metals or microbes, or both for that matter, move from the intestines to the spine, cause paralysis, that tiny little distance in the case of an infant? I've said before, I do think so. Whether paralysis is caused by a virus or toxic metals, Maready's explanation, the mechanism, the reason behind the oddities that we spoke of, in my view, it does hold up. Second, here's where we see the emergence of the first major crack in the argument that vaccines are what eradicated polio. I promised we'd go a bit deeper on this, and we will. So for now, let's just note the significance here. The significance is that the old definition of polio, I'm using quotes here, 100%, without a shadow of doubt, did involve a more expansive definition than we have today. Our definition of polio today means an infection from the polio virus, full stop. But the old infection was the symptoms of polio and any and all unexplained cause of paralysis, regardless of the presence of the viral infection. Why? Well, again, consider the timeline. Many cases of polio existed before the discovery of viruses, period. Some of them caused by the polio virus? Probably. All of them? Certainly not. Metals, other enteroviruses, right? Viruses of the GI tract, and other types of viruses even, including West Nile, a virus spread by mosquitoes, can cause what would have been referred to as polio back then. But they're not referred to as polio today. They're broken out into their own categories. And if this is the case, and it is, this would naturally lead to a decline in the polio numbers, whether we're actually seeing a true reduction in paralysis or not. That part of what was going on with the declining polio numbers was actually the move of other causes out of the polio bucket and into their own bucket. Okay, this is a point that Dr. Suzanne Humphries has made, both in her book Dissolving Illusions, as well as in her appearance on the Joe Rogan Show. And it's a point that Maready would agree with. And for the record, I do too. Now, is this change in the definition part of a plot to prop up the success of the vaccines? We're going to come back to that. Maready does weigh in on this, and his perspective, well, it may surprise you. But like I said, we'll get back into that a bit later in the episode. Let's be clear about something. As fascinating as it may be to learn that multiple potential causes of polio can and do exist, the discovery of this fact involved years of scientific and medical breakthroughs. What may seem obvious when presented in a coherent, logical argument with the benefit of hindsight today, that was certainly not the case at the time. The cause of polio was a mystery. And to get to the bottom of the mystery, scientists at the time would have relied on something called Koch's postulates, something that would have been leading-edge science at the time. which at the core of Koch's is an assumption of a single and universal cause. A single cause. And again, with the benefit of hindsight, I think it's fair to say, may have fundamentally altered the search for the cause of polio, and not for the better. So before we unpack the potential role that Koch's postulates may have inadvertently played in obscuring the true cause or causes of polio, let's discuss what Koch's postulates actually says. And here directly from Maready, where he says, quote, as they thought to understand the cause of various diseases, a set criteria known as Koch's postulates were created to determine whether a particular bacteria was the cause of the illness. The postulate stated that germ X must be found in all organisms suffering from disease X, but not in healthy organisms. Germ X should be isolated from someone suffering from disease X, introduced into a healthy organism, where it should cause them to also develop disease X. And finally, germ X must be recovered from that recently infected organism. End quote. Okay, so this is very logical, very straightforward, and we can see how in an attempt to be more rigorous, more scientific, things may have gone a bit too far. Because as we've seen, there's no single cause for the case of polio. But the assumption implicit in Koch's, and this was cutting edge from what I understand at the time, this really drove much of the thinking around disease pathology. And we could see how it could work well in some cases, but unfortunately, not in this one. It turns out that Koch's postulates are actually an incredibly high bar, one in which few, if any, diseases that we understand today would actually meet. And as a side note, this hasn't gone unnoticed. From what I understand, this is a major sticking point. I guess you could say a major argument in the debate between germ theory and terrain theory. Maybe we'll dive into this at some point in the future. But if you're not familiar with this controversy, while most of the world at this point accepts the idea that germs cause disease, the presence of a pathogen is primarily what drives illness, there's a vocal minority of people who reject this idea and instead argue that is the terrain of the host, I guess you could say the underlying vitality, or not, which drives whether the individual will come down with a particular disease. Now, this is obviously a 50,000-foot view of the idea, and I think it's fair to say, I hope I'm not mischaracterizing here, but there are people, and I'm not talking cranks, I'm talking people who have gone deep on the subject, have all the right credentials, who reject the idea that viruses and bacteria actually cause disease, and that our understanding of the role of viruses and bacteria is incomplete. Again, not weighing in on the debate at this point, but I will say this, it's a fascinating idea. And like I said, for those who argue the terrain theory position, the fact that rather than sticking with Koch's postulates, which was supposed to be the gold standard, it was sort of quietly swept into the dustbin of medical knowledge. That hasn't gone unnoticed. Okay, but the point is that for those attempting to understand polio in the early days, say attempting to wrap their heads around what would appear to be possibly the first epidemic of polio, an outbreak not in a rural town, not affecting a few teething infants, but bearing the classic dispersal pattern of an epidemic, and in the greatest city of the young powerhouse that was the United States, Koch's postulates, they were the tool. And here I'm referring to an outbreak of polio which occurred in 1916 in New York City. As I mentioned, there's much, much more to this book. We got to pick and choose. But Maready's discussion of the 1916 outbreak absolutely blew my mind. Not only because this is a far cry from the story we've commonly understood about polio, but because of the shocking parallels between this outbreak and COVID-19. Within the story arc of this outbreak, this 1916 outbreak, we get into social distancing, we get into vaccine development, and we get into what we might describe today as gain-of-function research, which took place less than a mile from the epicenter of the outbreak, which has caused many people to wonder, was this outbreak part of a lab leak? Was this polio outbreak one characterized by a substantially higher rate of infection, death, and paralysis than outbreaks of the past, with a pattern of dispersal that was completely different from outbreaks of the past? Was this epidemic truly a natural occurrence of polio, or Was this result of man's meddling with Mother Nature and it coming back to bite us? And the craziest part of all this, The Moth and the Iron Lung, was published in 2018, the year prior to COVID-19. So let's dive in. Let's start by going a bit deeper on what made this outbreak, this epidemic of polio, different. So the setting is the summer of 1916. And at this point, health agencies have started tracking and reporting on polio. And this is noteworthy because at this time in history, although paralysis from polio certainly would have been a scary prospect, diseases like tuberculosis and diarrhea killed thousands of people every year, a much more constant and pressing threat, given the average sanitation conditions for those living in a city like New York City at the time. Well, it's no wonder. But the summer of 1916 is different. A few cases of polio are common, but the numbers start to shoot up, and health officials take note, with a concentration of these cases centered around an Italian community in Brooklyn. Maready writes, quote, "A curious detail accompanied the epidemiologist's account. The victims were infants, predominantly boys, as had happened in the past, but the infection seemed to target Italian children, the immigrants living among the muck and grime of Brooklyn. Nurses manning the milk stations began to see concerned mothers bringing their infants in to be looked at. It was clear something was wrong. Their babies' arms were hanging limp by their sides, legs completely motionless." End quote. He goes on to say, quote, "Another disturbing trait began to emerge. This poliomyelitis was especially deadly. Although paralysis would typically start in the baby's legs, slowly ascending the spinal column to their arms, this outbreak could sufficiently paralyze their breathing muscles and asphyxiate them within a day. Amid the horrors of cholera, typhoid fever, or tuberculosis, diseases that any new mother had to worry about, nothing killed as fast as what these terrified parents were seeing." End quote. Okay, so we have an unusual concentration. We have an unusual level of destruction here, paralysis of the lower limbs, sure, but also of the breathing muscles, much, much more deadly. Newspapers began to report on the case count. With no cure or means of preventing the disease, and with little in the way of answers from the medical community, panic began to set in. And at some point in this story, the Rockefeller Institute, a charitable foundation set up by businessman turned philanthropist John D. Rockefeller, enters the saga of polio to play a leading role. Now, it should be pointed out that the Rockefeller Institute is a controversial one in the eyes of many people today, possibly at the time as well. Well beyond the scope of this conversation, but the views on the Rockefeller Institute range from sort of an altruistic, philanthropic organization set up by a benevolent billionaire for the betterment of humanity to a cynical, globalist organization set up to advance hidden, nefarious objectives such as eugenics and one-world government. And we'll just say, for now, that opinions differ. The first director of the Rockefeller Institute was a guy by the name of Simon Flexner, Dr. Simon Flexner, who Forrest Maready describes as possibly the leading expert on polio in the United States. Okay, interesting. And it is Flexner who becomes sort of the face of the medical response to the polio outbreak in 1916. Under Flexner, the Rockefeller Institute is also leading the charge to develop a vaccine or some sort of protective serum against polio. Quote, "Under the authority of Flexner, the Rockefeller Institute had taken the lead in trying to understand the nature of how the polio virus was spreading, how it was paralyzing, and most importantly, how a protective serum or vaccine might be developed for it." End quote. Okay, now if that name Flexner sounds familiar to you, massive kudos. It did sound familiar to me, and I'm glad I looked this up. Now, if you're familiar with something called the Flexner Report, which was released right around this time, I don't have the exact dates in front of me, but this was a report on the state of medical colleges in the United States issued to Congress. And critics of this report, now 100 plus years later, point to this report, this Flexner report, as the report that wiped out many of the colleges that focused on homeopathy, naturopaths, naturalists, herbalists that were practicing medicine in the United States around the time. Back in the day, there were many different forms of a, quote, doctor, and that could use the term doctor and could set themselves up as healers. And certainly there were snake oil salesmen among them. But what wound up happening after this Flexner report is that a particular type of medicine was the type of medicine that was propped up and allowed to flourish. And that's what today we would refer to as allopathic medicine. At the time, many forms of medicine were practiced, but this Flexner report was used as sort of the justification for taking significant action against homeopaths, naturalists, and other traditional healers. This is covered in a bit more detail in a book and a documentary called, I think it's The Truth About Cancer by Ty and Charlene Bollinger. So if anyone's interested, that's where you can find more about it. But this name Flexner, it's an unusual name. It stood out to me. And it turns out that the Flexner is not Simon Flexner. Well, it's his brother. Okay, so that's interesting. And this happens right around the same time. So again, one of these other little connections that gets the spidey sense going for the conspiracy-minded. Okay, so we have this epidemic. We have a wealthy philanthropist, a prominent doctor in the public eye, and again, the rush to develop a vaccine. Sounds a bit like COVID-19, right? Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation with connections to Tony Fauci, Rockefeller Institute, connections to Simon Flexner. Now, perhaps this isn't history repeating itself, but perhaps this is a time when history has a tendency to rhyme. But there's something else that's incredibly noteworthy in this story, something else that raises the suspicion meter of many people who have looked into this story. We pointed out that 1916 was very different from the earlier epidemics of polio. Not only was the dispersal pattern different, radiating from the epicenter in a way that we think of as epidemic today, but it was also much, much more deadly, something like 4 times more likely to kill, and with paralysis that still attacked the lower limbs, but also would move up the spinal column, cutting a path of destruction, paralyzing muscle systems until reaching the muscles involved in breathing, the end result being death from asphyxiation, an incredibly gruesome way to go. When you consider the vast majority of victims were under the age of 2, just horrific. People had seen polio, but this was different. Why? And it should be pointed out that if this outbreak was caused by the polio virus, viruses can and do mutate. Viruses in nature will, on occasion, become more virulent and deadly at times, certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. But there is something else that has raised the cloud of suspicion on this entire outbreak in the minds of some people. Facts of such significance that they just can't be ignored. Less than 1 mile from the epicenter of the outbreak in Brooklyn, scientists were hard at work and attempting to manipulate what they believed to be the polio virus to make it more infectious and more likely to paralyze its victim. In other words, to pretty much have the exact characteristics that were now defining this new epidemic. As shocking as that may be, it gets even more insane. Which institute, which group of scientists was performing this research? Who was behind the effort to upgrade the polio virus, making it more deadly, making it more likely to paralyze, more likely to infect? The Rockefeller Institute, under the direction of Dr. Simon Flexner. I've said it before, and I'll say it again. This is not the story of polio that we learned as kids. Not even close. Now, before you grab your tinfoil hat and scream, eugenics, conspiracy, by the beard of Edwin Black, the mad scientists have done it again. Hang on. Let's set that hat aside for a second. Not saying you might not want to pick it back up and put it right back on when it's all said and done. You might. But let's unpack this one step at a time. Now, why in the world would someone, anyone, want to make a more virulent, more deadly strain of polio? We're not talking some terrorist group here, some rogue state, but scientists, our scientists, the good guys and gals. And in light of this fact, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask the question, was this epidemic truly the result of natural evolution, or is it more likely the result of man's meddling with nature coming back to bite us? Said differently, and to draw yet another parallel in the aftermath of COVID-19, Was this gain-of-function research gone wrong? Or right, depending on how you look at it? Was this an unfortunate but naturally occurring epidemic, or the result of a lab leak? And the obvious question of why. What reason could possibly have existed for scientists to attempt the creation of a more destructive strain of polio? And it comes back to this odd aspect of polio, something we talked about earlier, a challenge in performing in-depth scientific research into polio. And it was the odd fact that scientists had a very difficult time replicating the effects of polio in the lab. It was believed that the polio virus was responsible for symptoms of paralytic polio. But when the tried and true method of injecting a serum from confirmed cases into, say, a lab animal, paralysis did not occur. Again, go back to those Koch's postulates. Single cause, injected back into the animal. Paralyze, not paralyze. Wouldn't paralyze. All the more reason to suspect that those early outbreaks of polio, the rural outbreaks, which affected both people and animals, were the result of metals as opposed to microbe. The only animal that scientists could paralyze in this manner was an animal far, far from the shores of the continental United States, the rhesus monkey. And according to Maready, the way in which they got it to happen was a direct injection into the brain. This is a far, far cry from the natural route of infection. And even that, from what I understand, didn't result in paralysis all of the time. So if there were a way to replicate the route of infection and the paralysis featured in the cases of polio in humans in the lab, that might advance our understanding of the disease and accelerate our ability to come up with a cure or a means of prevention. As crazy as it sounds, within the confine of the lab, the fact that paralysis did not occur, the fact that infection from subject to subject did not occur, well, this was a challenge that some scientists were actively working to overcome. And from that noble goal, the desire to study the disease and to come up with a solution, we arrive at what we might describe as gain-of-function research, in the horrific possibility that the most destructive epidemic of polio the country had ever seen may have been the result of a lab leak. Whatever your thoughts are about COVID-19, it's hard not to see the parallels. The increased virulence, the prominent charitable foundations created by controversial billionaires in the Rockefeller Institute and the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, the push for a vaccine, as well as the prominent doctors who became the public face of the epidemic in both Simon Flexner and Anthony Fauci, and their shocking connections between the very institutes performing the exact sort of gain-of-function research that critics would argue would lead exactly to this sort of outbreak in the Rockefeller Institute and the Wuhan Lab of Virology. And while these oddities within the 1916 outbreak have led many to conclude that the accidental release or a lab leak from the Rockefeller Institute was likely responsible, that to call this series of events a, quote, coincidence is just a bridge too far, Maready's own perspective is that this is not the case. And I'll say this, I was surprised by that. He does address this head on, so let's hear it in his own words. And for context, one idea at the time was that it was possible that mosquitoes, or maybe flies, were responsible for spreading polio. Okay, not a crazy idea. West Nile is spread by mosquitoes and can cause paralysis. So definitely not a crazy idea. With that in mind, the scientists at the Rockefeller Institute were not only working to enhance the ability for the virus to infect and paralyze, but they were also experimenting with mosquitoes as a means of transmission. So here's Maready. Quote, although the experiments with mosquitoes and mutant poliovirus strains so close in time and proximity to the outbreak may seem like more than just a coincidence, closer inspection suggests that they may not have been related at all. The bulk of mosquito experiments actually happened later in that year, after the summer was over. The studies involved jars of mosquitoes, small enough to sit comfortably on laboratory counters, quantities of insects so few that they would be unlikely to make the mile journey to Brooklyn without causing a disturbance along the way. Okay, so interesting. Some challenges in the timeline and maybe the distances, but, not impossible. Well, here's the strongest argument in my mind against the possibility of a leak from the Rockefeller Institute. Okay, so this is the strongest argument that says, no, this is just a coincidence. Maready continues, quote, researchers have been unable to promote the transmission of the polio virus through mosquitoes, so it would appear the flying creatures at Rockefeller Institute might not be involved, end quote. Okay, so that's much, much stronger. If the mosquitoes involved in the experiments were incapable of transmitting the virus, regardless of other similarities, the increased virulence, the greater ability to paralyze and move up the spinal cord, well, that would seem pretty definitive. And this, I believe, is ultimately where Maready lands. There's a lot of smoke here, but it's likely not a fire. Okay, paraphrasing, of course, but you get the idea. It's tempting to wonder if maybe there's a deeper conspiracy here. Maybe the timeline presented wasn't quite as clean. With thousands and eventually millions of mosquitoes involved, is it possible that some had evolved beyond what the researchers thought possible? Was there a cover-up involved? Now, these are all possible avenues of exploration, and you could spend a lifetime here. But even if the official story, or at least the one as presented by Maready on this point, are correct, without diving deeper down the conspiracy rabbit hole, I'm not sure that we have enough to rule out the possibility. And the reason is simple. Just because one possible vector of release, an infected mosquito making the mile-long trip to infect the first victim, may be unlikely, maybe even impossible. That says nothing about other potential avenues for release. Arguably the most likely, an infected researcher with a mild case of polio, maybe even an asymptomatic carrier, simply walking out of the lab. And we don't need to be conspiracy theorists to imagine this happening. This happens all the time, even in our modern era, with advanced PPE, advanced sanitation, and hazmat procedures. Accidental lab releases happen. 100 years ago, before anyone had even seen a virus under a microscope? I mean, we're talking the absolute infancy of this sort of research. It's not a possibility. It's an absolute certainty that accidental release would have happened, maybe even without anyone knowing about it. Now, was that what happened in this case? I don't know. But I'll say this. I don't think we can rule it out. I'm not there, not even close. Of all the incredible points in the book, and this is truly incredible, this would be the absolute number one question that I would have for Forrest Maready if we ever spoke. And I don't mean this in a gotcha sort of way, but this is a man who is incredibly well read on this, has thought very deeply about this subject. The fact that he came to this conclusion means something to me at least, so I'd want to know more. Now, I made two claims at the beginning of this episode, both that vaccines are not the most interesting part of the story, and that we would discuss the role of vaccines in polio a bit. Now, hopefully by now, you agree with me on the first point. There is much, much more to the story than whether vaccines were responsible or played a major role in the decline or eradication of polio. Important question, but not the most interesting. There's still so much more that we haven't covered. We haven't talked about DDT. We haven't talked about special forms of the Streptococcus bacteria that can cause paralysis in certain cases, right? Incredibly fascinating. This guy named Rosenau. We haven't talked India. There's much, much more, but we got to move on. And of course, that will give you a reason to buy the book. But the question does stand. What, if any, role did vaccines play in the disappearance of polio? And of course, it's now obvious why we have to tackle this question at the end. Because the definition of polio matters so much, and it has changed over time. When we say polio today, we mean a confirmed case of an infection from the polio virus. This is a much, much more limited definition than was used historically. Paralysis from metal toxicity, other enteroviruses, or even bacterial infections would have been categorized as polio. As the vaccines for polio were rolled out, the definition of polio evolved. And yes, because of that definition change, there would have been a decline in the number of cases of polio. Now, was this a result of intentional manipulation of the numbers? An attempt to allow the vaccine to claim undue credit for a simple statistical reshuffling? I'll just quickly point out, Maready doesn't think so. This is a long quote, but it sums up the crux of the argument so nicely. Quote, before the introduction of the Salk vaccine, if someone was stricken with poliomyelitis, they had to exhibit the symptoms for 24 hours to count on the register as a true case of paralytic polio. After the vaccine, it required 60 days of paralysis. With the flick of a pen, cases of paralytic polio began to instantly disappear from the record books. End quote. Okay, so that's notable, okay? Something we haven't even really talked about, but that the duration of paralysis mattered. A paralysis lasting 24 hours versus one of 60 days. Okay, and that came out with the rollout of the vaccines. He goes on to say, quote, it is impossible to talk about this diagnostic change without creating overtones of a conspiracy to hide the inefficacy of the Salk vaccine. This was decidedly not the case. No one was purposefully trying to manipulate the number of paralytic cases to make the vaccines appear to work. They were simply standardizing the diagnostic criteria to align with the previous trials of the vaccine so that accurate comparisons were possible. The timing of the change, coupled with the vaccine's recall, make it appear as though a calculated attempt was made to mislead the public. While the public was deliberately misled in other aspects of the vaccine's safety and efficacy, this was not part of it. End quote. Okay, so that's Maready's take. Okay, very, very interesting to me. And one little interesting thought experiment would be like, well, if they weren't going to standardize it towards what was done in the trial of the vaccine, and they went the other way, well, what would that mean? Right? It is sort of interesting when you think about it. There's not really a perfect answer here, or at least that's my take. So I'm inclined to agree with Maready. I think it's highly likely that the diagnostic criteria was an attempt to really hold the vaccines to the correct standard, to compare apples to apples. We didn't go into stories about the number of doctors racing to create a vaccine for polio, but it's clear that many of them were true believers, injecting themselves and their family members first, sometimes to disastrous effect. Now, does intent matter in this case? Even if it didn't start out this way, is it possible that modern advocates of vaccination have presented an overly rosy picture of the influence of vaccines on the reduction of the numbers of polio? Yes, I think that's a distinct possibility. In fact, unless I'm missing something, it would be almost impossible for that not to be the case, right? Without the correct asterisks, without the correct footnotes, the same term referring to two different things, yeah, that's going to be a natural consequence. And I'll say this, while the Moth and the iron lung has some incredible history on the development of vaccines, the Sabin vaccine, the Salk vaccine, and others, I'd highly recommend checking out Dissolving Illusions by Dr. Suzanne Humphries for a more in-depth discussion of some of the numbers. Okay, it's been several years since I read the book, but as I recall, she's got some great charts on the incidence of polio and paralytic polio mapped against the rollout of the vaccines. There's also this natural tendency for viruses to become less virulent and less deadly over time. For obvious reasons, right? If a pathogen simply kills all the hosts, no more pathogen. And I believe Humphries weighs in on this in greater detail with respect to the question of polio. Maybe we'll do an episode on dissolving illusions at some point in time, but probably not next. I think I'm all polioed out for right now. This episode has gone longer than anticipated, but I say that a lot. I've sincerely enjoyed this episode. I've said it before, but I am so impressed by what Forrest Maready has presented here. I believe that he has really, really done humanity and science, I dare say, an incredible service. The entire discussion about metals, this is something that so many of us never really go deep on, right? We never talk about the influence of metals. And Maready has gone even deeper on metals in one of his other books. Can I promise we'll talk about it? I think I can. I think I can say that we're going to talk about at least one more Forrest Maready book by the time this is all said and done, because he's just such an incredible thinker. I mean, just the way he draws connections and his writing style, it's so thoroughly enjoyable. Is he onto something? That's for you to decide. But I am thoroughly enjoying his work, so we're going to feature some more of it in the future. Okay, so that's going to be it for me today. Thank you for the listen. If you're enjoying the show, please consider liking, sharing, subscribe, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. Doing so won't cost you a thing, and it will help me grow this show into what I know it can be. Thanks, and I'll see you next time. Let's start with a simple question. What do you really know about polio? I'm betting it goes something like this. A terrifying disease emerges sometime in the not-too-distant past. Some lives are taken, others are left crippled or paralyzed for life. Scientists race to isolate the virus, create a vaccine, and finally bring the nightmare to an end. That's the version most of us grew up with. But what if that story is wildly, shockingly incomplete? What if the story of polio runs far deeper than we've ever imagined, and the most astonishing, most revealing pieces of the puzzle have been hiding in plain sight? In this episode of Unconditional with Norbie Schickel, we go in depth into The Moth and the Iron Lung by Forrest Maready and the untold story of polio, one of metals, moths, and microbes, and a century-old epidemic with shocking parallels to COVID-19. If you think this is just a story of virus and vaccination, brace yourself. The real story was far more than I ever could have